Hello everybody, this is me, this is Toby. Welcome back to another little Blender video. I thought I'd make a little something to show you what I've been up to lately. I've been playing around in Blender after the last video and see if I can achieve something of a more stylized look than the last couple of things that I did. So I made this little scene here with a character walking mine shaft and looking around and continuing, just a very quick test scene. And I wanted to see what I can achieve with sort of like on-set lighting and shaders. In the last couple of videos, I've been doing all the backgrounds in Photoshop, and I thought it might be cool to try out what Blender can do. And what I ended up with looks like this. I'm actually really happy with the results. And now I wanted to walk you through how to achieve a look like this because it is surprisingly easy in Blender. So let's get started, shall we? The first thing I did in this scene is obviously animate the character here. Like I built a very simple set background. You see it's like very wonkily modeled, but it's enough since it's mostly like a canvas on which our shader will get to work. And this character, it's really not a big thing like how he's animated. They basically drew a little stick figure and then like blocked very rough shapes over it. You can see the animation is kind of dirty and wonky and it's jumping around, but for now it shall serve us well. Then this character has a little prop in hand, which I chose to 3D model the little lamp, and I didn't want to hand keyframe everything. And since it's not deforming at all, just swinging back and forth, thought it might be cool to do this in 3D. So once the character is animated, and I animated him on 2s, you see like in here, I only animated every second keyframe, basically skipped every other single keyframe. So in a 24 frame timeline, you would only have 12 keyframes. When you animate 3D objects like this, it is very important that you also animate those on 2s. That means every second keyframe. You see, if I go slowly through the timeline, it's not moving, and it's like jumping into positions. It's not like going on smooth curves, but it's like jumping around. If I chose the graph editor here, and I have the lamp selected, and I zoom in, you see those are the single keyframes, and they're animated on steps. That means there's those little like stair structure in here, which means it will fit more naturally into like 2D animation like this character. All right. Then the next step would be I wanted to have a light source that is influencing the scene. And this is this thing back here. It's parented to the lamp. Again, if you want to parent something, like the child and the parent object, press the P key, brings up this here. And if you put object keep transformation, the object will follow all the motions of the lamp. So that means this lamp will now illuminate the scene naturally. Okay, the next thing that I wanted to do, if I switch back to this mode, you see there's this little effect back here. It's on a plane that is also following the light source, and we did this in order to achieve this sort of like painterly stylized feeling of like a dust or like a lens flare that's in the air around the light source. And I wanted this painterly effect, so I drew up a texture, Photoshop, something like this here. It's a PNG. I just chose a normal, like a scatter brush, and painted this inside of a circle. Looks like this, but without the backdrop, it's almost invisible. So I saved basically, I made 4 keyframes. I copied each keyframe 4 times, so it's like every 4 keyframes it will choose a new image to display here. And then I went to shading, and if you see this one here, this is the shader. Plugged it in here and chose image sequence. If you like multiple images as a texture, you have the option to make this image sequence. It's 60 frames long, so 4 times 4, and it will cycle through it. So when it's at the end, it will start at the beginning again. And there we go. I had this little texture. Now I wanted this plane to also follow the lamp. And this was a bit of a tricky one, since this lamp is swinging back and forth. You see, for example, here it's rotating a lot, right? For the light source, that's not really an issue. If you have this plane here, I didn't want it to rotate with the lamp. I just wanted it to follow the position. So we can't really parent it to the light source. But there's another way. We have here the tab Object Constraints property. If you choose an object, and then you go here and choose Copy Location, you can select an object and tell it just follow the position of another object, not the rotation and not the scale. So it's just copying the position. I actually made this little like helper object. You can have these very convenient helper objects in Blender, which is just basically empty objects. They're just there for like technical purposes. They won't render or anything. And I made this like as an in-between entity and parented the plane to it. It's good since I have the options to move it around afterwards. All right, so then I had my character set up, like walking through the scene, light source. Now, what to do with the background? I wanted to keep it very simple, and I wanted the light to have this sort of like a painterly style radius. And the way I did this is the following. Let's go to the shader tab, and I can run you through the shader for this background here. So first of all, in Blender, if you want to set up a toon shader, this is like the base material, basically, for this original material that we had. And this back here is the material output, which means this is the thing that will display and render. You can see if I take this, connect it all the way back here, we're back to the base material, right? So this is the color, for example. I can change it. And this is all the stuff that happens in between. And I can run you through very quickly what happens here. So the first thing to do if you want to set up a toon shader is a little node that's called shader to RGB. You can add a node by putting search up here and putting shader to RGB back here. We'll create this little node. You can connect the output of this base material to this one here. Shader to RGB basically says, okay, we're only dealing with flat colors. We're not concerned about all this stuff down here. Like technically we could probably choose another input, but for like easiness sake, I just left the same base material. It doesn't really matter. All right, the second thing that we wanted to do is establishing a color ramp. I will connect this to the output again in order to show you how this looks like without any of the on top effects. So this is all that we have when we just choose color ramp, right? So you see it only distinguishes between light and dark. Light is white and dark is black. And we have this little light radius that I can adjust here. It's basically the same as a gradient ramp in Photoshop. I have those two dots here that I can drag closer or further away from each other. And you have different blending modes. In this case, I chose linear. I wanted to have a bit of a gradient here. I'll get to that later. If I choose, for example, constant, we have like a very harsh, like just pixel white gap. This is just like the purest form of it. But I wanted a bit of a fall off, so I chose this one here. All right. Also, just to illustrate the point better, because this whole shader structure is actually very similar to how we would achieve something like this in Photoshop. So I prepared this thing here. And I can walk you through the steps of the shader and how we would emulate it in Photoshop. So that is what we did right here now, right? This is just like a light dot that is creating a gradient on a black surface. All right. So the next thing we wanted to do, we want to give the light and the dark, we want to give it different informations. There's two different textures in this scene. The one is for the shadow and the one is for the light. And I wanted to use this mask here to blend those two together, basically. So let's just shove this tree here a little bit down. We're going to get to this one at the end, actually. And let's just connect it like this and connect it like this. Okay. So this is light texture. Whoop. quite a bit wrong here. Yeah, there we go. So the first thing is we wanted to do is to create a shadow texture. So what we did is we choose a mix node. Again, edit search, and you can type mix. You find down here mix RGB, which is basically, it takes two inputs and shuffles it together using a blending mode. And if you click here, you see we basically have the same blending modes to choose from as you have in Photoshop, which is very convenient if you're used to Photoshop a lot of times. So what we did here is we choose the shadow texture and we plug this one here into color 1 and the texture into color 2, and we chose lighten. So in the simple way, if we have this in Photoshop, we would toggle on this texture, which is the shadow texture. This is normal, and if you put it on lighten, it will only affect the darker areas, which means it will only be visible on the areas that are black on the painting below here. And this is basically what this node does as well. All right, now to the light material. We have a second map, which is a texture for the light parts, and we just make another mix node. Again, search mix RGB here, and we put it on the output. We put this on darken. Similarly in Photoshop, we have this texture. Whoop, we see this is the normal texture for the set, and we put it on darken, and now it only affects the areas underneath it that are brighter than it. So we have this circle, and we see if we, for example, move the circle around, the focus of light will move as well. So very, very convenient. And now we have this very simple setup where the light source basically just creates this sort of like blend between the light side and the dark side. There is one last step though we wanted to do. I was really not a big fan of these kind of very sharp edges here. It really looks like a cheap toon shader, and I wanted to spice it up a little bit. So thinking about how we would do this in Photoshop. What you can do in Photoshop is use a texture, similar like this. This is just a generic noise texture that I have for like several use case scenarios in Photoshop. And if you put it on overlay, it will only affect the midtone. It means it will only be applied to those gradients here that are between the white and the black. And if I put those on again, you see, instead of just this hard machine-made gradient, we have this kind of more natural looking structure here. Again, if I move it through here, it kind of wanders through the structure. So we can do the exact same thing in Blender. So I decided I wanted to have, after this color ramp, like similar that in Photoshop where we plug it directly over the ramp, I wanted to have this little structure here. This is another mix node, and I put it to overlay, and I wanted to shuffle this noise texture that I just showed you with an overlay on top of this color ramp. So we think of this as a speed from A to B. This is basically just the second step after the color ramp. And again, we plug this into color 1, color 2. It mixes it with overlay. And if we connect this to this output, we see now we have this very nice structure here on the edge that if I skip in the timeline, there's a little bit of a noise going on at the very edge of the light radius. It was a very cool effect to have and surprisingly simple to create, and also it's able to play it back in real time, which is really cool, the viewport. Mapping, similar to the last couple of videos I made. I have these two cameras. This one is a set camera, and this one is the projection camera, which I use to throw the image I painted back on top on the set. If you want to know more about this technique, you can check out my other videos here on the channel. I go a bit more in depth on how to do a camera projection mapping. Cool. All right. So this is the scene. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I think it's very neat that you can make these kind of stylized looking artsy things in Blender, as well as the more classical stuff. And oh yeah, I have to make a big shout out to Lightning Boy Studios, which is another channel where the guy goes very much into detail about like toon shading. I learned a lot from watching his videos when it comes to stuff like that. So if you want to know more about this, go over there and check out this guy. Link is in the description below. And this was it from me today. So take care, you guys. Stay safe and see you very soon. Bye.